I'm going to mute all. So I will unmute you guys when you, here we go. I unmute Lindsay and unmute Rob and unmute Jamie. Okay. All right. Okay, let's get started then. Welcome everybody. There's going to be probably a few more late arrivals, but my guest can admit them while I'm doing the intro. So welcome to Psychedelic Safety Seminar number 9. This is a series of seminars we do every month or so, exploring issues of psychedelics and risk and safety and harm reduction. I'm Jules Evans. I'm the director of the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project, which is an NGO which particularly looks at difficulties people sometimes experience after psychedelics and how we can support them to manage those difficulties, but also general questions about ethics and risks in the space. So today, the topic is managing risks in psychedelics and extreme sports or adventure sports. This topic has come about for many years, actually, in psychedelics. People have often reached for the analogy between psychedelics and extreme sports. They say taking a psychedelic is like going diving, for example, that maybe you need to train and prepare. Maybe you need to get a license, particularly if you're facilitating other people's diving experiences. And even if you do everything right, there's an understanding that perhaps both in psychedelics and in diving, things can sometimes go wrong, that accidents can sometimes happen. There's simply a level of risk in these activities. And perhaps certain forms of diving, like certain forms of psychedelics, are riskier, like deep free diving, for example. Or certain types of climbing are riskier, like free climbing. Likewise, maybe certain types of psychedelic activity are riskier, like iboga or ibogaine, or going to retreats where you're stacking multiple psychedelics on top of each other, or just going to very hardcore festivals and buying drugs there without really knowing what they are. So maybe some forms of psychedelic activity are riskier. And I thought of this recently because the author Eric Davis, who writes a lot about psychedelics, he did a podcast where he talked about this analogy between psychedelics and extreme sports. And he said, we accept risks in dangerous sports, and we admire people who take those risks. Like, wow, that's you're a brave person. But why don't we do that with psychedelics? He asked. So he made this kind of interesting point. Now, we're at a moment in psychedelia and in psychedelic culture where there's a lot of new safety initiatives, safety institutes, harm reduction organizations, all trying to reduce risk in psychedelics. But I wonder, is there too much safetyism at the moment? Do we need to accept an element of risk, danger, surrender of control with psychedelics? Is ego death ever going to be something that's risk-free? So discuss these and other questions. We've got 3 excellent speakers. We've got Jamie Wheal, who is a speaker and author of books including Stealing Fire and Capture the Rapture. And Jamie speaks and writes on psychedelics and also does adventure tours for clients to access flow states. And we've got Dr. Lindsay Bira, who's a clinical health psychologist, a speaker, and she's training to provide psychedelic therapy. And Lindsay is the founder of Ocean-Oriented Neuroscience Times Nature, which provides immersive growth experiences designed to build well-being and resiliency, particularly involving diving. And then we've got Rob Ó Cobhthaigh. Have I pronounced your name right, Rob?
Coffee or Ó Cobhthaigh in Irish, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Rob has over 2 decades experience leading adventure sports tours, including kayaking down the Zambezi, sailing across the Atlantic. He then retrained as a licensed therapist and transpersonal psychotherapist and set up Inwardbound, which is a psychedelic retreat center offering psychedelic retreats in countries like Costa Rica, where I live. So the format is that each of the speakers are going to do a kind of intro talk for 5 to 10 minutes. And then I'm going to ask them some questions. And then after, we're going to have about 45 minutes where the audience has an opportunity to ask questions or make comments or share your own thoughts and experience on this topic. So I'm going to ask Rob to begin. Perhaps, Rob, you could tell us a bit about your deep experience of working in both these fields and whether you see any kind of similar takeaways in terms of managing risks. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Jules. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Rob Ó Cobhthaigh. I'm a psychotherapist accredited in Ireland, transpersonal therapist, and graduate of the California Institute of Integral Studies in Psychedelic Assisted Therapy. I co-founded Inwardbound psilocybin retreats in 2018, and since then, about 1,000 people have come through our psilocybin psychedelic retreat process, broadly speaking, in the tradition of Dr. Stan Grof. Before that, I was an outward bound guide. So I spent 20 years. I began in Africa, Zambezi River, White Nile, in the late 90s, early 2000s. I was a whitewater kayaker. I traveled all around the world kayaking some of the biggest rivers in the world, the Indus, the Nile. That was my life. It was my life for all of my 20s, pretty much, and I loved it. We pushed hard at that age as a young man. That was my therapy. And it was like a tribe of people. There was tremendous connection, and it was beautiful seeing the world from that perspective. At the age of about 30, I had some pretty big life crises, heartbreak, and also I saw a lot of things on the river. I saw a lot of tragedies. There was a lot of accidents occurring around me. Class 5 kayaking at that level is high risk, and things go wrong. And over a long period of time, you see things go wrong. So I guess it's fair to say I've seen both sides of the benefits of taking risks in the outdoors, especially as a young man, and I've also seen the consequences. So as a result of those experiences at the age of about 30, I began this inward journey where I started doing more yoga, meditation, rediscovered plant medicine, which I had, experimented with as a teenager in Ireland. And I suppose I started going inwards and looking at myself and at this time I was training as a psychotherapist. I was also working as a mountain guide. So I guided expeditions to the Himalayas, to Kilimanjaro, Everest Base Camp, things like that, the Andes. So I was very, very immersed in the outdoor world. That was what I did. And in Ireland, then I trained for over 2 decades, I trained outdoor guides. So if you wanted to be an outward bound guide in Ireland, you went through I taught in a university course that trained young people, young men, young women to do what I did. So I was really, really immersed in the outward bound world. And then I rediscovered psychedelics, and I started working with them for my own personal growth and healing. And over time, then eventually over a long period of time, I began holding space for other people, and eventually it led into the work I'm doing now, which is working specifically with psilocybin in a group retreat setting, in a therapeutic setting. So what's the similarities? So without overstating the analogy, because there are clear differences, let's state that from the start. But I do think there's a very important and worthwhile conversation having, especially around the managing risk piece. Outdoor sports have decades, generations of experience managing risk in dangerous environments. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from the psychedelic therapy field in general, from adventure sports. One is around acknowledging the risks, because sometimes I feel in this space, certainly until now, and there's great work being done now around acknowledging the risks that can occur from psychedelics. That's the first step, acknowledging the risks. And then once we've done that, taking risks to actually mitigate them. So to minimize those risks and to acknowledge when some risks are too great. So I just like to put it out there early on, the difference between personal decision making in the outdoors. So as a 21-year-old, pushing my limits, my own personal limits, whitewater kayaking on a big rapid, is very, very different from guiding a group in the outdoors, or guiding a group, and the different level of risk that is ethically acceptable from a personal perspective and from a guiding perspective. I think that's important to acknowledge to begin with. So the great pioneer of adventure therapy in the UK was a guy called Colin Mortlock, and he wrote a book called The Adventure Alternative in the 60s now, I think. And he identified the difference between, adventure, early adventure, peak frontier adventure, peak adventure, and misadventure. And this concept is relevant, I think, in that, you know, what we're trying to avoid in adventure sports and in psychedelics is from people flying too close to the sun. So the myth of Icarus, I think, is useful there, where, if we take too much, or if we don't, if we make, errors of judgment, and we make mistakes, people can very easily get into a misadventure state, which can be very negative, can be very damaging. So we're trying to find that place, the sweet spot. Jamie writes a lot about this in the flow states, where people have, the best possible outcome with the minimum possible risk, or finding that, just that sweet spot when everything is in the perfect flow. Yeah. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by really thinking about the risks, looking at where we can, what risks are unacceptable, what risks are acceptable, and then maybe as a field, coming up with shared risk assessments, shared consent statements, so the field as a whole comes up with an ethical framework that we can all agree on, that is leads to the most best possible outcomes. When we talk about risks, I think it's also really important that we talk about benefits, and that part of the equation often gets forgotten. We live in a very risk-adverse society these days, and while we need to acknowledge the risk, we also need to acknowledge the potential benefits of psychedelic assisted therapy. I'm a therapist, a psychotherapist. I personally believe that psychedelic assisted therapy potentially, for some people, has more benefits than other forms of therapy. As a result, it may be that the risk profile is higher, and that may be acceptable in the equation that we come up with of what is socially acceptable. What is, I've personally experienced pretty much all the major psychedelics at this stage. I've done iboga retreats. I've personally sat with 5-MeO. I'm aware that certain psychedelics have much greater risk potential than, say psilocybin, in my opinion. But it may also be that those substances have a greater potential to help certain cohorts of people. For example, ibogaine for severe addiction, and so forth. So, yeah, they're my initial thoughts. Let's look at the benefits. Let's look at the risks. Let's have open conversations. And the other important thing I'd like to mention is the difference between risk and consequences, because sometimes there can be risks and the outcome can be consequences can be quite low, but then there could be a risk where there's a major consequence. And it's important to acknowledge the difference between the two. If risks are acceptable in the outdoors and in psychedelic assisted therapy, then occasionally we need to honor that there will be consequences and come up with ways to mitigate or help support people when those consequences occur. And I think the way to do that is have open conversations around these risks, not try and hide, belittle, shame. Things can happen at any time when you're working with psychedelics. The unconscious is unknown by definition. Another analogy I like is when we're exploring the benefits of exploring the outward world and exploring your limitations is quite similar to exploring your inner worlds, to your unconscious. And sometimes people can go too far, or they need help, or they need support. So yeah, having these conversations, opening this as a field, I think is really important. Yeah, I'm really happy to be part of that. So that's my initial statement or initial point.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Rob.
Phil.
Brilliant. Jamie, let's come to you next. You write about and you teach flow states through psychedelics and extreme sports. As an opener, which you can take in whatever directions you want, do you think risk can be managed in these kinds of states, or is there always an element of being out of control, and that's part of what gives us flow states?
Yeah, well, first of all, hello everybody. Wonderful to be here. And when Jules reached out to, just sort of test our interest in this. This to me is one of the most meaningful and helpful set of case studies that we can all use to deepen and tighten both best practices in psychedelic therapy, but then also just kind of what analogies, what analogs do we think are like it, and how does that inform both how we operate as a community of practice, but also how we also socialize, everything from media coverage to government expectations to certifications and all that kind of stuff. Because my simple answer is hell no, of course they're not safe, and that's precisely why they're so bloody valuable. And we would even have students come into our groups and their parents, the sort of helicopter parents, you're about to take our kid into the Colorado mountains for 3 months, in the winter, towing sleds and sleeping in snow caves or doing various other stuff. Is this safe? And it's like, of course it's not safe. It's high risk activity. So we're not going to pretend and tell you that it's safe. We're going to learn and teach how to manage risks. And so both pre-briefings and debriefings become essential. And in the pre-briefing, and we still do this even in our leadership courses that we teach near the Grand Canyon, in fact, near Cataract Canyon, Rob, so right off the Colorado River, some of the most famous rapids in the Colorado River. In our pre-briefings, we give a list of all the ways you can get fucked up and die. There is rockfall, there's 1,000-foot cliffs, there are rattlesnakes, there's heat stroke, there are flash floods, there are snowstorms, there are the entire litany, to the point where if you were, you might just scare away potential clients. You are exhaustive in highlighting and pre-briefing all of the ways that things can go wrong. You then conduct the event and then you debrief. And the debrief has at least 3 levels. One is an incident debrief. So if something happened, you unpack precisely why. This is in the military and special operations, whether that's SAS or SEAL teams, whatever they call them, after action reviews, AARs. So you conduct your AARs. And if anything did go tits up, you explore exactly why and how. But you also debrief near misses, right? Which is a crucial one, because especially in psychedelic therapy, there are all sorts of dodgy experiences that happen. And then by the skin of our chin and the grace of God, it works out. And we are like, oh, you've got to break down to break through and things like that. Be like, no, 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 you rewind that tape and roll the dice a few more times. That could have been snake eyes. So you debrief near misses as well. And then ideally, you pour them into the larger data set, which is the best practices of the community. So over time, and this is really, really crucial in spiritual domains, and I actually had a direct experience with a couple of kind of bent guru types in this space, and I was like, oh, okay, because they were convinced they weren't bent. They were convinced they could grab the ring of power and not get corrupted. And it was like, I think you're getting bent, And what I realized is I was like, oh, there is something profoundly beneficial about the aggregate wisdom of a large data set that is better than the judgment of any singular guide, no matter how experienced. And a couple of those would be, 56% of avalanche deaths occur on days of moderate or lower hazard. So you're like, oh, that's interesting, right? Not the red days. On the red days, people are actually paradoxically safer. More than half of the deaths you get buried in, right, come from a day that's yellow light to good. So you wouldn't know that as an individual. Your heuristics, your own decision making, your shortcuts and rules of thumb would lead you to have lower vigilance. 70% of all fatalities and high altitude mountaineering accidents occur after a successful summit. Again, you wouldn't ever think that yourself, and no individual, having just rung the bell, and in this case, taken our self-summit selfies and been like, whew, that's a load off, right? Would think we now have 2 out of 3 deaths are about to happen. And we actually just experienced this. We were just guiding in the Utah canyons. We just did a 200-foot rappel off a dry waterfall, right? So it was, relatively straightforward, but still, something that you can, if you bugger it up, it's binary, right? Got everybody to the bottom of that, but we weren't out of the canyon yet. There was another exposed city, but everybody been kind of sitting around. They'd had their adrenaline shot. They were high-fiving. Everybody felt like we did it. We did the thing. But actually, the next 60-foot walk around with potential fatal falls was our actual risk based on the aggregate data. So having that accrued wisdom of a community of practice that is wiser than anybody's in the moment decision making is also another essential piece. So yeah, I would say, Jules, in the simplest sense, I think that the psychedelic community needs to, as rapidly and sincerely as possible, start changing our analogs. These aren't fluffy blankets and unicorn rainbows. right? And everybody pops the pill, and in 3 sessions or less, you too can be cured of your lifelong PTSD, right? It's much more, this is high risk, high reward terrain. We do everything we can, including the pre-briefing. So don't say you weren't warned. Like ontological shock. I think to me that would be another one. I think it's ludicrous that we have such casual approaches to ketamine therapy at this point, with no understanding of like when are we going to tell them about the bats, or 5-MeO for veterans, and you're like, okay, yeah, that might in some way dislodge something and give you access to something, but it is also a complete ontological skullfuck that you may spend the rest of your life putting those pieces back together. And if you don't have any structure, any ritual, any community, any lineage, any legacy, you are rudderless in the multiverse slash the hell realms. And the fact that we are just sort of like, oh, GABA excitatory things, antidepressive effects, the fact that we have overly clinicalized and medicalized the misto feels profoundly irresponsible from where I would sit. Because if you're not including those elements, these aren't just epiphenomena, they're not just adverse side effects. They are for all of thousands of years, the entire point of the psychodynamics, community and spiritual domains of these experiences. And so I actually wrote about this in a book called Recapture the Rapture, where I explicitly make this point, because if you think about, where is MAPS right now, where are the MDMA trials, where was the pushback from the FDA, et cetera, it was pretty, in my estimation, there was all sorts of things going on that we don't need to unpack here. There were different actors with different agendas weaponizing various interpretations and frames and models as to what was going on. But in some respects, the FDA was not surprisingly highly risk averse and don't really know what they're looking at. And as a result, if they map it against prescription bottles that you can take completely out of context and they just do what they do, and it doesn't matter what the context is, doesn't matter what the cultural frameworks are, doesn't matter what the interrelational connections are, doesn't matter what the epistemic or ontological or spiritual implications might be, of course, psychedelics come across as deeply weird and unmanageable. But if we had negative experiences on a mountain, right, if somebody just waltzed up there with no preparation, right, in inclement weather on high angle terrain and didn't know their ass from their elbow, and they fell off, right? You wouldn't rope off the trailhead or dynamite the mountain. You would simply say they had no business being where they were. In Rob's case, dropping into a class 5 river. And in both, in climbing, there's a sort of acronym EOR. Are your anchors EOR, equal, opposite, and redundant? Right? So are they balanced? Can they take loads? And if one blows, do you have others to back you up? In boating, there's always the added rig to flip. Doesn't matter if you just think it's a lazy float. Right? Doesn't matter if you couldn't think anything could possibly go wrong that day. Rig to flip the boat so that nothing spills out, and just in case, right? Just in case. So this is just a quick little passage. I'll just read it to you guys. It says it's helpful to think of hedonic engineering, and in this case, I would include psychedelics as a major category of this. Helpful to think of it as NC-17, fifth class rock climbing. Definitely not for kids, and the falls can kill you. You wouldn't go wandering up a dangerous mountain without ropes, anchors, and harnesses. If you did and hurt yourself, you'd have no one to blame. On the other hand, equip and train yourself and venture humbly into consequential terrain with trustworthy guides and partners, and you'll be rewarded by the satisfaction of the ascent and the view from the top. It's precisely because it has risks that this experience is rewarding. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. So both speakers raising some really interesting points and avenues for further discussion. We're not just talking about psychedelic risks, we're also talking about kind of spiritual risks, kind of experiences that can have very high life-changing positive benefits, but also can really put people's lives, give them serious setbacks that take a long time to recover. And we've got some good questions and comments in the chat as well. So now, Dr. Lindsay Bira, I'll come to you. So you're training in psychedelic therapy and familiar with that world, and you also run kind of courses offering immersive growth experiences through diving. So first of all, what is it about immersive growth experiences, whether in nature or in psychedelics, that can be so transformative, do you think? Is an element of risk or edge part of the attraction? And also, you're come into the psychedelic kind of culture and the psychedelic industry a bit through things like training programs. Perhaps you have friends in the space as well. And what have been your impressions about where it's at in risk management at the moment?
Yes,
Uh,
sorry, that's my little tiny dog over there. Um, yeah, great questions. And as I start here, I just want to give a big thank you to Jules for creating this initiative to where we can talk about not just psychedelic safety from an intellectual and procedural perspective, but also on the ground with people who have actually experienced real harm from taking psychedelics, not just without supervision, not just unplanned where they shouldn't have been, but through very researched methods under shamans or facilitators who are well respected. There is harm that is happening, and we're seeing it in the clinical world, and we don't know what to do with it, which is why things are not getting approved. So, I love your questions here. And to do a brief introduction, so I'm a clinical health psychologist. I have a dual specialty in both trauma and behavioral medicine. I come very heavily from the research world, from academia. My specialty is using evidence-based treatment, which means science and research-based treatment and ways that work to get people back to a functioning level very quickly. I worked for years with the military, where I was treating combat trauma in military leaders and doing some of the top research studies in the world for this. I did my residency at Harvard Med. I did a 2-year trauma fellowship and dual specialized in medical issues as well as the effects of trauma. So, as I continued on my path and I became a professor of psychiatry at a medical school, I also started my own business because I thought, some of the things that we are doing to treat trauma and to treat stress levels after somebody had one heart attack, because we know if we give stress reduction treatment to somebody after they have one heart attack, we greatly reduce the chance that they're having a second heart attack. But I saw a gap in this. Why are we waiting until the first? Why aren't we disseminating this information about resilience so that people don't even have their first heart attack or their first depression episode or can climb back out of the hole more easily? People deserve to have this information around evidence-based treatment. So I started my own company. I started a private practice and a speaking business. I also started working with wounded warriors, where I was going out on adventure, week-long trips with veterans who were severely disabled. This combined both my experience in treating PTSD in the military for so many years with my entrepreneurial spirit and belief that we need to be doing things in a different way to help people learn. Fast forward over time, I helped universities create scuba diving programs within the university to pull in student veterans and create collaborations in a way that made them better academically and helped treat their PTSD through mindfulness of breath underneath the water. And it's interesting to even reflect on my path now, because it's one of those things that, when you follow your passion and you follow what you believe to be true, even if the world says this doesn't quite make sense, you form links that form a chain. And so as I sit here in front of you guys today, I have a private practice, so I'm still a clinical psychologist. I see people one-on-one. I still speak, and then I also lead my ocean company, which is about taking people into the ocean, where I serve as both a performance psychologist and a freedive instructor. And I take people under the water to access new depths of themselves. They see how their brain works in real time, so their stress levels come on board. We watch that in real time, and then they create new relationships with that in real time. Jules, one of your questions was so good about, what works when we go through new experiences that pushes our edges? Like, why is that effective? Whether we're talking about adventure sports or something like psychedelics. This comes back to what we know works in the mental health and psychological science research. It's about creating psychological flexibility as opposed to psychological rigidity. What gets people out of depression and anxiety is having an experience or a medication or a realization that creates a wider perspective of their own situation. So it gets them out of over-personalization. It gets them out of victimhood mindset. It gets them out of distrusting other people because suddenly they have a different, more wider, more wiser perspective. Now, we can do this through evidence-based treatment in private practice. And if you get a good therapist, then they're going to make that happen pretty quickly because they know how to tap into that. Psychedelics, that's like a super highway to a fast shift in a totally new perspective. MDMA is highly effective in that because suddenly you get this sense of empathy where you never had it before, and it connects you with other people in the world and even yourself in such a beautiful way. But we know that integration is highly, highly important. These things do not stick unless it is fully integrated in ways that help people take action in their life with the relationships and conversations they're supposed to have. And as a clinical psychologist, having gotten into the space of psychedelics, maybe, what year is it? So about 3 years ago, I started to get into this. And, I had never done, many drugs, maybe some marijuana, back in college and grad school, but I had never touched anything because my brain was very important to me. And I was getting my PhD and I was doing my residency and I didn't want anything to mess with that. But as I saw the research coming out about how powerful this can be for mental health issues, and not just that, to stimulate creativity for people who are leading initiatives in the world, I thought, I can no longer move forward as a psychologist unless I understand what the heck is going on here. And so that started my journey into understanding the underground psychedelic world, into understanding different substances and what they do neurobiologically, and even my own anecdotal experiences of trying certain things and understanding what these experiences were bringing me. Now, on the same token, and part of the high level intellectual ability that people can have is to hold two opposing truths in the same space at the same time. And what's both true about psychedelics is they are highly powerful and highly dangerous. And what I have learned mostly through my journey through psychedelics is that there are some terrifying things happening in the underground world. And not many people are properly trained to hold space, especially the ones who think that they are. And we have seen people have psychotic breaks and they're not coming back. We have seen leaders in big psychedelic initiatives who are leading people into their own journeys die, literally pass away in the name of their own spiritual exploration. We see the development of spiritual narcissism that happens very easily with a big dose of psychedelics. Why? Whether you're looking at mushrooms, ketamine, ayahuasca, you get shown you are God. You are on a mission. Show the people. If we have any predisposition for narcissism or mania in the picture, that can activate it in a way that now we have a picture of spiritual narcissism, and we have a person who is not trained and is not competent to be leading people into extreme cognitive shifts and alternate states of consciousness. Like what it's not good. And so in our private practices, we are seeing people coming to us in psychotic breaks with anxiety levels that we have never seen naturally before, and with nervous systems that are so messed up, we don't know what to do with that. One extra thing I will add on to there are people who are under the influence of a psychedelic, and we all know the amazing neuroplasticity ability that psychedelics have. It releases growth factors. So while psychedelics are within us, and even days afterwards, maybe weeks if you're looking at a longer acting one, our brain is able to wire in ways that allows what we see and understand to persist. But if somebody has a trauma reaction under the influence of a psychedelic, or if they're exposed to additional trauma, like sexual abuse by a shaman, or something really weird happening, somebody else attacking somebody else. Now we have baked in trauma in a neural circuitry that did not exist before, with the flooding of growth factor that wires in a trauma response that, as clinicians, as a psychological community, psychiatric community, we don't know what to do with. And I think the saddest thing about this is these people who are having issues, the first people who they speak to are people in the psychedelic community, in the spiritual community. And the things that they hear are, it shows you what you need to see, not what you want to see. Oh, you just haven't done the work. You need to integrate more. And these things are so wildly unhelpful and the complete opposite to trauma-informed care. It's astonishing and horrifying to me. So my journey into psychedelics started with some real powerful experiences and some great excitement. And as I continued, the harm that I began to see, some of which I experienced myself, was intolerable to me. As a clinical psychologist licensed to keep people safe and help people get better, I cannot sit with some of the things that I'm seeing in the psychedelic movement and in the underground world. So part of my mission in this has been to use my voice to hold people accountable and make sure we're doing things in as much of the right ways possible. Now, when we get to the commonalities of how we grow through experiences that push the edge, I think it was Jamie who just made a great point around, what's the point of not pushing the edge? That's a pretty boring life. And we all know that we grow the most when we're stretched the thinnest. And we also know that we get those shifts in perspective that create psychological flexibility through being pushed to the edge and finding new edges. So yes, it is extremely valuable to be able to have experiences that have some unknown and that make you say, whoa, I don't think I can do this, or I'm not sure if I'm okay. But to have the right guidance, roadmap, and human support that helps you navigate any difficulty. Training and preparation, holding space while you're in it, and then integration afterwards. Unfortunately, I have yet to see the level of training in most people that I trust to do all of those things well. When I'm doing my own work, so in my private practice, I lead people through ketamine. So of course, my specialty is in trauma. So I get kidnapping victims, I get, just really severe cases. And so I lead them through ketamine experiences, mostly sublingual. So I'm with them as they go through it and we process a lot of trauma. There are some very intense things that come up, but very beautiful experiences as we move through that. In my company, Ocean Oriented, this is about growth at sea. So I am taking people under the ocean to 1 atmosphere of pressure or 2. So that's 33 feet or 10 meters or 66 feet or 20 meters. There's levels of certification. And what happens is the physics of the ocean acts upon your biology and brings forth the mammalian dive reflex, which is an ability that we all have to function extremely well underwater with only 1 breath of air. This is not scuba diving. This is free diving. You are using everything that you already have to function well underwater. And so while we're doing that, we're watching what the brain does. Now, yes, I don't care who it is. If I bring somebody underwater holding their breath with no breathing apparatus, they're going to freak out. Their brainstem's going to react, their amygdala is going to fire up, and they're going to have a survival stress response, a fear response. But in that window is where we can do the real work. Now, yeah, we're pushing edges. If we look statistically, though, freediving is much safer statistically than scuba diving is. Freediving is also a way to work on yourself. Scuba diving, you have a lot of artificial equipment. It's just kind of not the same physically or emotionally in terms of the work. And there are things that we're doing that are pushing the edges, but we have this ability within us. So it's actually relatively safe, but it doesn't feel like it is. And that's the key there because people are really pushing themselves. I think with psychedelics, it's a lot more of a wild card. I know every person who I bring under the water, what's going to happen to them physically and psychologically. And I've got a roadmap for that, right? Psychedelics, though, even ketamine, I don't know what every person is going to have, what their reaction is, what I'm going to have to manage. With something like mushrooms and ayahuasca, complete wild card. We have no idea what's going to come up for people. And so I personally, going through this year-long training program to work with psychedelics, I did it more to kind of understand what was going on in the underworld, and it caused me much more concern than it did calmness around it. But what I decided is I will never hold space for mushrooms or anything like that. I'm going to let somebody else take on that risk, but I will prepare people for it and provide comfort if they need it and do the integration work because I know how to do that with things that come up. one thing I will say is this past summer, I had a veterans organization contact me and say, can you do an ocean-oriented expedition for veterans? And I say, well, yeah, sure. I've worked with them for so many years.
Mm.
And she said, well, what about veterans with limb differences, specifically somebody who does not have legs? And I said, yeah, because what? I'm not going to tell a handicapped veteran no, right? Why would I do that? But immediately after, I started questioning. Why did I say yes to this? I couldn't find one other person in the world who is teaching a double amputee veteran to free dive. No other person is doing it. I started to think I must be crazy. The nights of sleep that I lost around this was pretty intense because you don't want to kill a man. You definitely don't want to kill a veteran, and you definitely don't want to kill a veteran with handicaps. Not a good look, right? But we did a lot of preparation with my team. I really researched it myself, mapped everything out. We ended up doing the expedition, and it was the most profound, powerful growth experience, not just for him, but for me. And so that was an incredible lesson around the magic that can happen when you do push the edges and you say yes to things that maybe have not been done before, but with the right team, the right preparation, and the right framework to make sure nothing bad can actually happen.
Thank you, Lindsay. So,
Thank
yeah, sorry, I'm just you got a little over time. Do you have any kind of last point or?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, all right.
Need to be very careful about risk and have the frameworks in.
Fantastic. Thank you again. Candid words. So let me take a point you made and put it to Jamie and Rob. Do you think that there's a difference between psychedelics and adventure sports in that it is a bit more of a wild card and it's actually more unpredictable what might happen to people, psychologically or physically? Or do you think that, I mean, Rob, you obviously kind of are prepared to take on risks that Lindsay isn't in terms of holding space for kind of paying customers. Do you think then that that unpredictability can be managed to some extent? So what do you both think? And keep your answers brief if possible.
Yeah, I'll come in there. Amazing points and very valid, everything that's being said. Um, I think the difficulty in the work with psychedelic therapy is dealing with the unknowns of the unconscious. And Lindsay's right. We don't know by definition what the contents of any person's unconscious is including our own. That's why preparation and screening are so important. And I think preparation and screening go a long way to mitigate risk. They don't completely eliminate risk, that's for sure. But it can help a lot, I think, in creating a container that is safe or safer. There's always an element of risk. That's definitely true. I like the metaphor of the sea. The sea is very, very beautiful metaphor for this type of work and diving. You know, the ocean can be so calm, so beautiful, but it can also be terrifying. And that's a perfect analogy for the unconscious. You know, the famous Joseph Campbell quote: the psychotic is drowning in the same waters that the mystic is swimming in. Does that mean we never go to sea? You know, I think we do have to go to sea. I think that's where the tremendous growth is, but to really think about how to navigate as carefully and safely as we can.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jamie.
Would you mind just reframing the question or just restate it?
Well, I mean, Lindsay suggested that there's a difference between psychedelic spaces and like adventure sports type things. Like she knows more or less how people are going to react when they go diving, the kind of risks that they might face, and she feels confident she can manage them. But she doesn't feel that about psychedelics, that they're more unpredictable. And so she said she doesn't want to be kind of facilitating sessions because it's too unpredictable what psychedelics might do in someone's system. Do you think that there's a difference, that they are more unpredictable, more of a wild card?
Well, I mean, there's the old saying, and it gets assigned to mountaineers, boaters, pilots, you name it. There are old mountaineers and there are bold mountaineers, and there are no old, bold mountaineers, right? So you could say the same about psychonauts or psychotherapy or psychedelic therapists. My sense is that shit happens in all of these domains, and there's nothing but sort of humility of accumulated experience. Personally, I mean, quick show of hands, how many folks are actually therapists and or in some form facilitating psychedelic experiences just on this call? Yeah, I mean, in some respects, like hats off to you. I wouldn't go near it. And funnily enough, like the reason I don't in all of our, organizations and training and development is because my sense is that, it's like climbing, it's like guiding. If you have somebody on your rope, right, you are responsible for them. And if something goes sideways, you are responsible all the way back to the trailhead. And then potentially you can be like, that was a total shit show, and I never want to go in conditions like this with you again. But I am duty bound to get you back to that trailhead. And if in a psychedelic experience, it's somebody has a breakthrough breakdown, somebody destabilizes in their, in the aftermath, somebody comes unglued when they go back home, decides they're going to quit their job. There's a very funny Burning Man blog post. You can probably Google it, but it's called "Don't Divorce Your Parakeet," which is about how to integrate after Burning Man. And it's just this list of hilarious things that happen after people have profound and destabilizing experiences. And so organizationally, professionally, we always have made the commitment of we'll take you 80% of the way there. And then like a surgeon that has to take a vow, an ethical vow not to operate on their own kids. We don't operate on our own community. We will refer that out so that we don't conflate roles in teacherly authority, and then also so that we can kick your ass on Monday morning, but also because it's messy if you are the one who was on belay when that person and half the time, right, they will untie halfway up the mountain. Because like if you think about rock climbing, the person down below that's feeding the rope and keeping that rope tight, or at least close to tight, is to catch that person. But if they climb up and they go around the corner and you can't see them anymore, and then they decide to untie their rope, they decide I can fly, or they could decide I'm going to free solo because I saw that in a movie once. And then suddenly you're like, wait, the rope is gone, they're still up on the mountain, and I no longer have control of the risk, but I'm still ethically committed to that person who just fucked off against our agreements and understandings. That becomes a recurring problem. So hats off to all you folks. I mean, in fact, if it's okay, I will just in the name of this, I just want to share one. Here we go. Let me just share this. And I know that some folks here in this community knew James. James wrote the book Tryptamine Palace, which was all about 5-MeO. He also published this essay in the MAPS Bulletin. I think for a time it was their most downloaded essay. But he was an extreme sports, aficionado. He was on MTV's original X Games kind of like sports show back in the day. He wrote about it. And then he sadly died in a paragliding accident. A couple of years ago in Nevada. I think it was before or after Burning Man, but he was kind of part of our whole extended communities. And he just pointed out that, hey, one of the greatest sort of little secrets of this world is that there always was, through the Rocky Mountains, through Sierra Nevada culture, through Hawaiian surf, communities and towns, there was always this connection between extreme sports and psychedelics. And in some respects, they sort of, as the high watermark of the Thatcher Reagan era came up and the just say no to drugs, it was those mountain towns that were this kind of the last repositories of psychedelic Grateful Dead nature mysticism, and that there were a ton of incredibly hard and challenging first ascents and big extreme events done in what he called the psycholytic dose. So not microdosing and not macrodosing, but enough to inform and expand your awareness and attention, and immerse deeply, and improve endurance and sense perception and all sorts of things. So he was just an advocate for saying this. And what I realized was um, that's the world we came up in, went to grad school in Boulder, Colorado, got into guiding, did all those kind of things. There was just a very organic community of people who would climb boats, ski, push their limits in the daytime, get together and dance on psychedelics to live music at night, right? And rinse, wash, and repeat. And everybody had medical training, everybody had swiftwater rescue, everybody had wellness, like avalanche training. We kind of knew our shit. And there was just a sense of embodied responsibility because Kali's a fierce mistress in the daytime. Gravity does not lie, right? And it only takes a cupful of water to drown in. And there were funerals, as Rob alluded to, right? There were losses in these communities on a regular basis, right? And so that was the sharp end that kept you honest. And there was no, and critically in the kind of Instagram, TikTok, psychedelic wannabe shaman space, there were no middlemen. There was not a culture of deferring to gurus, right? Of following others with feet of clay. It was meritocratic. And I didn't realize until this kind of current millennial upswinging in the psychedelic renaissance how many beautiful elements of just psychedelic Rocky Mountain culture, how effective that was, because everybody was opting in and fundamentally managing their own risks. So back to your point, Jules, about like, what is it like? Is it different? Is it the same? I think that facilitating people professionally is something I wouldn't touch with a goddamn barge pole, because it's either, in it to win it, like I love you, and this is a relational connection, and we are Dharma brothers and sisters, or fools rush in, because the consequences and the wobblies are just myriad.
So let me I'll come to the audience questions in 1 second, but just for some general ones, let me point out the obvious way these two things are different, of like extreme dangerous sports and psychedelics. Both attract edge people who thrive and seek peak experiences, like James Orrick. But I would say, and maybe tell me if I'm wrong on this, I mean, but psychedelics is also really attracting in the last 10 years people seeking healing, very vulnerable people who might be high in neurosis, low in openness to new experiences, but they're in the last chance saloon and they hear a lot. The psychedelics can help when other treatments didn't. The kind of people who probably aren't going free climbing, skydiving, in fact, the people who might run a mile from those kinds of activities. So is that a mismatch of what used to be, let's say, in the 70s and 80s, kind of an edge culture for people who like the edge, and now it's kind of bringing in people from the kind of 90s, noughties mental health crisis who are looking for a kind of fix? And I think that maybe also changes how they're being sold to the public as well, right? Like, you don't have people, big wave surfers saying, hey, everybody come to Nazare. Like, Nazare can heal us all. We should all be going to Nazare. Actually, the kind of veterans of dangerous sports, they're not really necessarily evangelizing it. And they're very upfront about the risks. As Jamie was saying, they list the risks, boom, boom, boom. And that's not, I feel, what psychedelics are like at the moment. They're evangelized. This is going to heal the world. This is for everyone. And because they're trying to get through that FDA needle, that people, the culture doesn't always talk much about the risks. So let me just say, I mean, this is a difference, right? Is there any way to square that circle in your minds between the fact that this is a risky, somewhat dangerous activity that's being marketed to the most kind of vulnerable people? Any thoughts on that from the panel? You can just stick your hand up if you want to.
I'll go ahead and comment.
Sure, thanks.
So yeah, I just started a group that is on the overuse, misuse, and over promotion of psychedelics, because I'm seeing this across the board. And I do think that we need to be a lot more aware of how we're promoting it to people, because people are having bad experiences. Even veterans who were not suicidal before are suicidal after they're doing a psychedelic experience. Now, nobody wants to talk about that. And the people who are leading these retreats, they're not going to vocalize that and let that be known. And there's nobody holding anybody accountable, like a board, to make sure that these things are being looked at. It's the wild, wild west, or the wild underground. So unfortunately, things aren't being tracked like negative experiences, which is why Jules' work is so incredible and important. But it needs to be accounted for, and especially with vulnerable populations, to let them know some of the risk. What I think is difficult about this is, if we enter into a psychedelic experience with too much fear, then our nervous system is going to lead us into somewhat of that fear experience within the psychedelic potentially. But that said, I think we need to be very aware and communicating of the potential risks, just like we do with aspirin. If you read the aspirin bottle, or the side effects on that, it'll make you not want to take it. But that's the point, right? So that people are informed. And I think it comes with a double whammy. It's my last point here of both that people know that it can be harmful, but we need an infrastructure of what to do when somebody's had the harm. And we don't have that yet. And so people will always get into it, even if they know the risks, but we have a responsibility to make sure we know what to do when somebody comes out of it and they are more destabilized than they ever have been. We have to be able to keep them safe.
Yeah, there's the analogy of what's the chamber called if people get the bends diving and you put them in the kind of, is it decompression chamber?
Yeah,
And we need things like that, I think, for psychedelics as well. I mean, there are beginning to be these kinds of specialist clinics for post-psychedelic difficulties, but there's like 3 in the world and 2 of them are in Berlin. So we need more of them. Rob and Jamie, do you have any thoughts on that? Like the kind of the messy overlap between healing culture and trauma culture and kind of edge peak culture, which you get in psychedelics.
Yeah, yeah, amazing points, super interesting discussion. And yeah, I would say yes. In my early 20s, I was one of those, I chased peak experiences as young men often do. I was looking to find my limits, and I found them eventually. Nature is the great humbler, nature and the great healer. So I changed personally from a philosophy of doing in nature, chasing achievements and first ascents, to more being in nature, to adventure therapy. Just being in a natural environment in itself is healing. So I do agree. There is a great risk in chasing peak experiences, like the archetype of Icarus I mentioned at the start of the call. That's something we collectively have to watch. Also, to acknowledge again the difference between making personal decisions based on personal responsibility. Sometimes people choose to do reckless things, and situations where they're in a guided group, whether in the outdoors or in psychedelic assisted therapy, when therefore there's a less of a risk threshold that will be acceptable. Just one other two, yeah, just to agree. I agree. Psychedelics are not for everyone. I think that's a message we should be very clear on. That not everyone should be doing psychedelics. It's not for everyone. There's many cohorts of people that they're not suitable for. I really liked what Jamie mentioned. I think there about the psycholytic approach, and maybe we need to revisit the psycholytic approach, which was the medium dose, where there can be tremendous benefit in being in a natural environment or learning a sport in that middle frame where you're not at like your peak experience. It's not the hardest river or climb that you've ever done, but there's still tremendous growth and benefit. So maybe we need to focus more away from those peak experiences and more on that psycholytic dose for many people. That could be where the real healing occurs. And yeah, the most dangerous stage for me of learning any sports, adventure sports, is near the beginning, just when you start getting good, you know. When you don't know what can go wrong. That's when you're a liability. And I think, yeah, psychedelic culture may be at that stage a bit as well, where we're at that stage. Exactly what Jamie said. There's old kayakers and there's bold kayakers, but there's no old, bold kayakers, you know? So, yeah, so many interesting points there. And one last thing about rites of passage. Just want to mention this. So a lot of the work I've been doing over the past decade has been men just doing rites of passage without psychedelics. And rites of passage were what initiated men and women had their own into manhood. Many of them involved an element of risk. So what is it in the human psyche or soul that is attracted to pushing, learning, growing? And that's something we need to recognize as well.
Jamie, do you have anything to add? I can't actually remember what the question was at the beginning, so don't ask me, but
Yeah, no, I think you were saying the intersection of healing culture,
right, that's it,
and sort of, more edgy psychedelic culture or psychedelic underground. I think that's a super important thing, right? Because of all the fluffy puff pieces, you are seeing people who this was not a subculture or community they've come up in any way. They've either come in medically, as Lindsay was describing for your own experience, right? I was looking, there's plenty of clinicians who are like, well, SSRIs don't work nearly as well as we need them to. And so I'm curious about this. So they're coming in from an academic or a medical point of view into what is actually, at least in the West, a 70-year plus psychedelic underground. culture and community. And then you have the folks that are coming into the, the goop. I saw the goop thing on Netflix and I'm still sad. Let me go and check this out element. And that is obviously contraindicated if somebody is having trouble keeping their head above water. They are not a good candidate to go to Nazare and learn tow-in, surfing, big wave surfing. So there is some obvious litmus as to integration versus disintegration on just managing 3D. And if you are having a hard time managing 3D, then 5 or 10D isn't going to help. Right? There is some level, I have a super egoic set of scripts. Oh, I have a monkey suit that if I unzip for a minute, I can step out and boy, it feels good to stretch and, be true. But the potential knock-on consequences are massive. So you might say, I think, 10% of the population should never do them. This is dark triad, this is family history, pre-screening. Only 10% should ever do them more than 1 to 3 times in their life. And the middle of the bell curve should probably, right, engage them as potential initiatory rites of passage, possibly marriage ceremonies, and possibly death preparation. And if we spent the rest of our time integrating and living according to those things, that we would probably get more of the marrow out of the bone versus just constantly kind of rolling the dice on increasingly random adverse events. And you might say that, hey, actually, serotonergic psychedelics probably just not that, that they may remain for the worried well and or the people seeking active spiritual insights. If somebody is deeply, deeply banged up, the only, relatively guaranteed safe one is MDMA, right? As everybody knows, it's not actually a classical psychedelic. And even then, I've experienced people who have such a control script that as they experience MDMA, you're like, this should just wrap you in a warm blanket and leave you feel safe, secure, loved, introspective, all the good things that, MAPS has been talking about. And instead they get violently ill. They have psychosomatic reactions. It seems like their body only reads the amphetamine element. They start vomiting, they start, or experience none of the positives. And then you're like, okay, so even that, right, has contraindications based on the personalities. And somebody just asked about holotropic breathwork as a potential tool, as a modality. And this goes back to after action reviews of near incidents, near misses, right? We were doing a sort of a pretty comprehensive version of hyperventilatory driving, but there was a lot of spinal movement, fascia, various other elements, cranial nerve resets, vagus nerve, toning, etc. So it was relatively strong, but nothing crazy. And we had somebody have a full abreaction down to long-term childhood sexual trauma, which, bless her heart, she was, because again, you're hyperventilatory. When was the last time you were in that state? Quite often it was a stress response, trauma response. So everyone who's like, oh, breath work is like, yeah, and you can re-trigger people. And as it happened, she, within a safe container, was like, oh, wait, this is different. I trust these people, but we've been together for a week. It's a really beautiful community. It was a good thing. So she was like, I can actually let go this time instead of spin out. But she then spent 6 months in massive psychosomatic cascades, including going to the hospital, including ER visits, including all sorts of things, where you're like, wow, that was a very weak catalyst and a pronounced result. And so psychedelics for the deeply traumatized, I think, is probably best left in the realms of like Lindsay and other like very structured, highly responsible medical and clinical situations, not the more the merrier situation we're currently in.
Thank you. So we've got some great questions and comments. I see that Bob Jesse, hi Bob, he's here and he's mentioned that he worked on the Decriminalize Denver campaign and the Oakland deprioritization campaign. And Bob, I know this is something, do you mind if I ask as well, that you have spoken about this analogy of dangerous sports and psychedelics and talking about risk reduction as opposed to harm reduction. Would you mind for unpacking that idea just briefly?
Be happy to. Thank you. And by the way, thank you for a fantastic conversation. Deeply needed. Hope a lot of people get to see this video. I've come to prefer using 5 words instead of 2. Instead of harm reduction, how about risk awareness and risk reduction? You can't reduce a risk unless you're aware of it. I think one of the problems we're facing may be quite transient. I don't know if that means 5 years or 10 years or a generation, but we grow up knowing that motor vehicles are dangerous. Everyone has seen a car crash. Most of us know somebody who's been in a car crash. We know the full litany of bodily and psychological harms that can be associated with those crashes. Even people who have not been rock climbing generally know that gravity works. It has not been known to fail. So people engaging in these activities or even walking on a sidewalk with motor vehicles, at some intuitive level, we get that this is not a risk-free activity, and we look at the benefits and decide to walk down the sidewalk anyhow. The issue with psychedelics, it's been pointed out already earlier, if you're running a political campaign, the general line of thinking is you can have no negative messaging whatsoever. I want to give a little bow to the people running Decriminalize Denver. I approached them when I first saw their website, which is all about Johns Hopkins proves psilocybin cures depression. And we had a long conversation. Johns Hopkins hasn't proven that. It may help to treat depression in some people. Some people are non-responders. Some people may be harmed. At the end of the day, they decided that they wanted to include on the website some information that was not entirely positive to counteract the notion that psilocybin is risk-free. I posted a Google Doc that has a slightly edited version of what Decriminalize Denver actually put up. They are the only campaign that was willing to say anything negative. And I just have to share this with you. The person who's running that campaign, these, by the way, are all amateurs in the sense of the word, meaning not paid professionals doing this work. So, Bob, we've thought about it. Understanding that this might actually harm our political campaign, we want to go ahead and have you write out some text for us. We're going to put it there because you know what? We'd rather say something approaching the complete truth. And if we lose, that's okay. We'll try again next time. Goodness. Another thing about harm reduction, that phrase came about, I believe, during the early years of HIV/AIDS crisis, before ACT, before there was a treatment. Drug counselors working at most drug treatment clinics were allowed to practice therapy with only one endpoint that was acceptable, and that is abstinence. And if you taught something other than abstinence, then you were somehow encouraging or endorsing drug use, and you could get fired. So people figured out, well, if we're going to push the envelope on that, let's talk about harm reduction. People are clearly dying because of infectious diseases. And do you want people to die? Would you rather have them live a little longer and then possibly become abstinent later? So the term harm reduction was chosen because it reinforces the narrative at the time that drugs is always harmful. And the best you can do is reduce the harm. Now, if you're a public health person and you think in terms of, rates of harm per 100,000, that's accurate. Most people don't hear it that way. So if I'm talking to somebody about psychedelic use and talk about harm reduction, I'm transmitting the message that it's always harmful and all you can do is have less of it. Whereas risk cannot be reduced to zero. So that's my share on that point.
Thank you very much, Bob. Okay, we've got another question from another person in the audience with a lot of experience as well. This is from Steve Bagley. Steve says, I've been in the psychedelic harm reduction space, shortly to be renamed risk reduction space, since 2012, working at events like Burning Man, Envision in Costa Rica, and we see hundreds of acute adverse reactions over the course of any given event. Working with acute psychedelic crises has showed me just how unprepared some facilitators are for dramatic and inevitable adverse reactions. My question to the panel is, what are your recommendations for helping psychedelic naive people make sounder decisions about vetting facilitators? Who would like to start there? Lindsay, would you like to start? It sounds like you maybe have uh, had the occasional experience of a not so good facilitator, at least, maybe one. And you came into the space with a kind of evidence-based um, mind. You don't strike me as a kind of reckless thrill seeker. So how do you suggest, the psychedelically naive could vet the spaces where they might choose to go through this kind of experience?
This is a hard one because even with all I know and all of my amazing community in this space and the research I did, I still was unable to detect somebody who was not trained and not able to hold the right space. So there's questions that we can ask, but I think every psychedelic facilitator knows what to say. And even people who've had good experiences with somebody, that doesn't mean that somebody, that facilitator, can hold space for a negative experience. So what I think is what I would like to see happen is that every person being a facilitator is involved in a board, almost like it couldn't be a licensing board because this is still illegal stuff, but it would be a board that you can only hold space if you are qualified by this board, which would include standardized training. It would include trauma-informed care and training on that. It would include a lot of amazing modules that you, as a seeker of an experience, could be able to ask, oh, are you part of this board? That's how we find licensed physicians. That's how we find licensed mental health practitioners. They're licensed. That means they've had to meet certain criteria and be trained in certain ways. To me, that is one of the safest ways and most predictable ways to vet who is a good facilitator and who's received the proper training, vetted by the people who have ethics in the right space. Who can also be held accountable if they mishold space or if they cause some type of trauma or crossing of boundaries. Somebody can report them to the board. That's why we have licensing boards, right? This does not exist in the psychedelic space. So I'm really unsure how to answer this because I've experienced and I've seen so many people experience asking the right questions, finding somebody who seems to be really vetted, and something very strange and weird and harmful happening. So I don't really know what to say that further.
Right, right. So, I mean, that is an issue. These risks are increased by the illegality and the undergroundness of these kinds of practices, of course. Jamie, what do you think? Do you think there's ways to vet the spaces or in which, or the people with which you choose to do some of these things?
Yeah, it's really easy, actually. You just ban all the fucking millennials on Instagram with big dumb hats. Just cleans the space up in a heartbeat. Right. If they have a little mushroom symbol, if they say they're a medicine server, if they're a haole saying they're a shaman, you just kick them to the curb right away. And then on the more sincere level, I would highly encourage you need to have some baseline medical training. If you don't have some form of wilderness medicine or first responder training, you're way out over your skis. And that obviously happened with that MAPS lawsuit from the Zendo from many years ago, but I believe it was at Lightning in a Bottle or another West Coast festival where, if we're running the everything, the kind of, it's basically the Dick Price Esalen lineage, which is you've got to break down to break through and everything is workable, which on the one hand is beautiful because it doesn't pathologize what could be a spiritual emergency. But on the other hand, right, it has led us to negligence in the light of acute physiological stress situations and or compounding effects from histories that weren't screened, et cetera. So fundamentally, that at a bare us minimum. And then also just, and this is a tricky one because I'm unclear as to whether this is as I'm having a spiritual emergency and how do I vet a facilitator, or I'm actually hosting something like Zendo and how do I screen the people who are going to come as volunteers or subjects. But the other is just, how integrated is that person? And what is their actual, what are their effectively clinical hours in hyperspace? Like how, and it's not always the more the merrier, right? It's not like, oh, I've been to 76 IO retreats, bro. Like that does not a better facilitator make necessarily. But if we're talking about folks absent any indigenous lineages, and currently we don't have any, the underground, as I just shared with that James Arak bit, was a self-selecting underground in the action sports community. What do we have now as indicators But I would say fundamentally, the cut of their jib, do they appear grounded? Do they seem open? Are they balanced and resourceful humans? Is their shit together personally and in their life? Do they have some baseline first responder training or more? And do they have something that resembles? This is not unlike if you're choosing to go on an expedition, you check in and you're like, oh, so what rivers have you boated? What boat do you, and if they're clearly clueless, then what have you climbed? Where have you been? Who have you climbed with? Are there overlapping relationships in our network of practitioners or peers? Like all of those kind of ways to check and to test, I think would be helpful, because my experiences, even with some MAPS approved medicine servers that are wildly naive. They're doing these gobbledygook mishmash spiritualities, waving eagle feathers and smudging sages in four directions. It's children at play in the fields of the Lord. And that is only going to go badly for us. And if anybody's following Matt Johnson's work at Hopkins and now Shepherd Pratt, right, he published that, I thought, very helpful and important paper, which was, be careful of smuggling in your own greatest hits, therapists. Even little things like having a Buddha on the windowsill or this or that, or that you're just smuggling in your own ontology to a very susceptible person. And how pristine and clean are our facilitators also matters, because otherwise we're bringing in just the mishmash that is the spiritual marketplace at this point.
Yeah. One of the official.
Just to add.
Yes, go on, Rob.
Just to add to what's been said already is trust your intuition. I mean, if trust your gut. If this is like one of the most important therapeutic relationships you can have, and if you do not feel safe or comfortable with that individual, just listen to that deeply.
Right, exactly. I mean, I get people coming to the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project, and they say, I went to this retreat even though I had a bit of a bad feeling and there was this kind of yellow flag in the screening process, or it's not worth it. You don't go skydiving with someone if there was some yellow flags or you had a bit of a funny feeling. There are so many options in the psychedelic space that don't ever go with someone who you've got any reservations about, because it can have, long-term impacts. I was going to ask you as well about the variables. This is another question from the audience. Say in kayaking or diving, there were kind of variables you look at when you're trying to assess risk, or skiing or climbing. What are the variables in psychedelics, do you think? I mean, Rob, you're kind of one of these brave people looking to manage these variables with clients. What would be the variables you would look at? Starting with, I guess, astrology, like, it's like the movement of the planet, but in the kind of traditional graph kind of thing.
Yeah, so the usual contraindications that are well mapped at this stage. But I would add to those, there's more. Someone who's got an overwhelmed nervous system, someone who's in crises, severe crisis, someone who's very ungrounded. We just don't want to work with those type of people. And it's really having the relationship. The relationship is what holds the space, the trust. And if the trust isn't there either way, then it's not a relationship we or they would like to proceed with. Yeah, just one other thing. It's off topic a bit, but I've sat in the Amazon with some of the great Shipibo maestros in Dieta, which was one of the great gifts of my life, one of the most incredible experiences of my life. And in those indigenous communities, things go wrong there too. Like some of the worst adverse reactions I've ever heard occurred in the Amazon, occurred in Peru, So what complicates this whole area is these different paradigms coming together, the biomedical, the clinical model, and then there's the indigenous paradigm, which is completely different and maybe has a different level of risk or different perception of risk. So yeah, there's many complexities here.
Yeah, I mean, and Jamie said something at the beginning about if you take someone up a mountain, you've got an obligation to take them back down. That is not the case at all in practice in psychedelics. You get, if you're lucky, like one integration session, and then, particularly a lot of underground therapists will cut and run at the first sign. They'll ghost clients at the first sign of anything difficult. So, then you get people, adrift for months, spending thousands looking for solutions. I mean, I'm talking about the worst case scenarios here, but they do happen. So there is not that at all, that ethical, professional obligation in psychedelic culture yet of, if you take someone out, you bring them back. Okay. Arabella. Rob's got a question, Heffernan, in the chat about statistics of harms. Rob, I'll put something in the chat now where we've just gathered together. But I would say briefly, there's emergency room admissions. There's some data on that. There's some data on deaths where the kind of I think psychedelic related deaths, which are low. And then we're just beginning to track kind of, which I think will be the biggest body of harm, which would be like people feeling worse psychologically afterwards, and sometimes much worse. So we're beginning to kind of gather data on that just in the last 3 years or so. And I'll put a link to a summary of some of that data in the chat. Arabella.
Thank you, Jamie. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you to Steve for your question. I volunteer with Psychcare UK, and as a military veteran and emergency room nurse for 15 years, I can totally sympathize with trying to create policy and vet people in a space that is ultimately born from grassroots, and as it attracts interest from healthcare professionals, do we risk losing what makes us different to normal sort of event services? And it's really difficult water to navigate. So I do appreciate your question. To the speakers, I was fortunate enough to have taken part in one of the Heroic Hearts Project UK retreats as a recipient. They were doing PTSD research. I'm now an ambassador for them and hoping to support them as a liaison in the future. And we're hoping to run women-only retreats. I know because for lots of the women that take part in the US retreat program with Heroic Hearts, most of them were victims of sexual abuse. And I'd like maybe for you to speak to how we can sort of manage the risks and the benefits of having female only or having mixed retreat groups as we sort of start to recruit for that, just so that we can support people in the best way possible.
That's a really good question, Arabella. I'll jump in on that. What's hurt in relationship is often healed in relationship. And yes, it can be very complex as a man working with a female who has been on the receiving end of sexual abuse from a male. On the flip side of that, there's also possibilities there to reframe that relationship and to for something incredible to therapeutically to occur in that space. So I would say it depends. Like every question around therapy, there's so many variables, but it depends. But it can be very powerful working with someone of the opposite sex. And the same, I've witnessed it with female facilitators, with males who've had sexual trauma. So it can work both ways. It's also true to say that female only and male only spaces can have tremendous power too. So it really depends on the individual and their history, and what feels right for them and what feels safe for them.
Thank you,
Rob. Okay, just another one. I'm interested to know how the presenters prepare participants for their adventures, particularly psychedelic adventures, but other adventures as well. Any quick thoughts on that? And then we can round up. So just very quick answers. Lindsay? How do you prepare people for a ketamine session?
Yeah, for a ketamine session. So one, for them to understand what to experience physiologically and emotionally and psychologically. I think what catches people off guard and what sends them into a stress or trauma response is when they feel the flood of the psychedelic coming on and they can't release, surrender, and melt into it. But if you can describe exactly what they are going to feel physiologically, and specifically knowing them as a person and all of their defense mechanisms or coping tools that they use, are they a high control person? And so as they feel that letting go, they're going to be fighting against it. And now their heart rate's increased, blood pressure increased. They're having a stress response that equals trauma. So that's not good, right? So whenever I prep people for their experience, what I found to be very effective is to tell them exactly what they're going to feel, and at every point in time, letting them know what to do. I also give them key, very simple words like the word melt. So I tell them, tends to be people's favorite, is as they're going into it and they feel themselves resisting, remember that word melt, melt, melt. And that melts their muscles, that melts their airway system. They just melt into it. So I combine that with their own personal work, because usually we're all working on something related to surrender and letting go of control or embodying love. And so if they have those purposes as they go in, then it aligns with how they're relaxing into the experience as well. So I think those things are very important. I think also preparing them for if they're having a bad experience to remember that it will end. So I learned that early on with somebody who had a bad reaction to ketamine, was like, make it stop, make it stop. I was like, oh, sister, it's not going to stop. So you're going to have to be in it for a bit, right? But because she did not realize she couldn't just pull herself out of it, she was having this fear reaction that I had to manage. So now I tell people, if you are freaking out and scared, you have to remember that the best way past it is through it. So remelt. It will always end, and you have to trust in that. So I help them understand what's happening in their body. Most of these substances will never affect our central nervous system. This has been really important for my ketamine clients to understand. Even if they feel like they've lost their airway or they don't know if they're breathing or not, for them to have the knowledge, which they're able to access under the influence, the knowledge that no amount of ketamine affects your breathing, your heart rate, or your actual ability to live. That science allows them to trust it and relax into it. So I think those preparation points have been just really crucial for me.
Thank you. Rob and Jamie, quick points. How do you help clients prepare for transformative experiences? Just maybe one point will do.
Be honest and be authentic. We work in a very client-centered way, so we always listen and hear their concerns and be super open and honest about what can occur. Try and get consent in advance about everything, especially you're in touch. Being open and honest about what can occur in a psychedelic experience, and clear communication and trust. It's all about trust. If the trust isn't there, I don't think it's possible to do this work. So building that therapeutic relationship, and it has to be integral, it has to be real. It's not real, people are going to see through that straight away. So that creates the safety, that creates the container. Same in the outdoors, same skill set. People, if you're a guide and you don't know what you're doing in a mountain environment, people are going to see through it straight away. Likewise on a river, pretty much the same skill set, and being open and willing to acknowledge when you're having challenges, when things are going wrong, to be able to speak about that too.
Right, but you're absolutely right. And there's a low barrier to entry in psychedelics. You see that on psychedelic LinkedIn, people who are, like 1 year, 2 years out from their first experience, and now they're calling themselves a kind of, expert in the space or whatever. So now, Jamie, we're just out of time, but do you have a kind of last thoughts? I mean, on the question of preparedness or any kind of anything else on this topic? What will be your closing thoughts?
I would just say the words from the old alchemists, on engaging this work: make haste slowly.
Very good. Thank you very much to Jamie, to Rob, and to Lindsay, to all the experts in the audience as well. You'll all get the recording of this. If there are any other questions for me or for the speakers, feel free to email me, and I'll try to help with any resources that people are looking for. There were some questions we didn't get to. And in Rohan, you asked about advice for help with post-psychedelic difficulties. So I will ask the speakers if they will share, and I can send that over. Okay.
Actually just responded to that, so I'm going to just copy paste it real fast for everyone here. So if you want to copy paste that, take that down. That is just some basics on what I found to be most helpful over time for people.
With people with post-psychedelic difficulties. Okay, thank you very much. If you want, just give people a chance to kind of get any of the chat. I think maybe I can send you the chat as well in the email, so you'll have all the links. Yep. So would you like to maybe just unmute and thank our speakers for giving their time and their expertise to us today and sharing it in the name of reducing harm. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Indeed.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you to the speakers, and thank you, Jules, for finding great speakers.
Thank you for organizing it all, coming together.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Okay, see you
Bye-bye.
next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.